Alright, so now what I'm going to do is get started on reassembly. And the first thing is I need to press in this bearing race into the steering box. And I've had this in the freezer, getting really cold. Ooh, it feels cold. And I also had the steering box in the oven heating up. So I had this in the oven. I heated it up to 200 degrees. Now what I got to do is I have to throw this bearing down into the throat of this thing and then tap it in. I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but the bearing goes right in the top here. Let's put it in. Okay, so there's another bearing race that needs to be installed right here in the end of the input shaft, where the input shaft goes in, and it's another one of these type of bearings in a race. And this race has to come in from the inside and sit in here, sit in the end of this cup. So I'm going to do this while this thing's still a little hot as well. And this bearing is at cold room temperature. And now I will tap on it with the socket and the mallet again and get it to seat. And I'm going to use a big enough socket so that I'm on the shoulder of the race and not on the inside of the cup. And this one, it's on there. Alright, so I'm going to tap this with the mallet and make sure that it's seated. Alright, so that was in. It wasn't too hard. Again, I didn't have to pound on this thing to get that race to go in there. It's just, it actually still turns in here. I'm not so sure that's a good idea, but this is hot and the bearings are a little cold. I also want to now put the bearing race in this this adjusting screw piece. So I had the bearing in the freezer. Again, I didn't heat up the adjusting nut, though I probably should have put that in, but let me just see if I can just push this in here. Yeah, it goes in pretty good by hand most of the way, so I think now it's going to be easy just to finish it off on the vise. I'll just put it face down and then hit it. I noticed some wear marks on the end of this adjusting nut that correspond to the ball carrier. Now you can see how this sort of fits right in there, or in some fashion these two fit into the housing that way. I'm thinking maybe I should try and sand this down a little bit, smooth it out so it doesn't catch on the edge of that. Alright, so now I'm going to put the needles into the bearing races that are inside the steering box. And what I'm going to use for grease is this Motorcraft Premium Long Life Grease. It says it's on the back here, it says this is meets Ford specification ESA-M1C75-B. So this is the stuff that I think Ford used originally inside the steering box. It's black, it's nasty looking, it smells greasy. It's very similar to what the stuff is that I took out of here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some grease on my finger. I'm going to put it inside the bearing here and get that all coated up so that the needles have something to stick to. And then I'm just going to take a few needles at a time and put them in there and slowly pack it up, pack them around. So first let me get some of this grease. That's going to act like a glue. I'm going to put that into the bearing. And then I'm just going to distribute that all around. Okay, so now I have these tweezers that I can use to take the bearings and just put them in the race. And then I can put my finger down in there and work them right in. So I think that's going to work fine. So this is what I'm going to do for the full 37 bearings. So we'll come back when I'm finished. Alright, so I've developed a little technique to do this. And what I do is I put 3 bearings in, 3 needles, and I put a little bit of grease on my finger. I stick it in here, and then I can work the 3 needles into the bearing race. And then what I do is I rotate the bearings around so that they're going up into the race, and I always leave the little bottom edge of the race open, because then I take the next 3 bearings and I put them back in the same spot, because it's easy for me to see that where I'm dropping them in. I just drop them in parallel to each other, and they don't even have to be fully in the race cup at this point, because then when I stick my finger back in here, this is when I shove them down into the cup and work them into where they belong. Alright, so success. I have all of the needles in this first bearing. So let me finish doing this end, and then we'll go on to the next step. Alright, so for the next step, let's assemble the ball screw onto the worm shaft. So the first thing we need to do is get some grease on the end of the worm shaft. And to do that, I'm just going to take the end off of the grease tube and stick it onto the worm shaft. And that'll impart some grease all over these threads, like that. And now I will take the ball screw. It doesn't matter which way you put it on. If you look at it, the holes are, so if you look at it here, the holes are bottom left, and then in the bottom left hand corner. And if I flip it around, it's still bottom left hand corner. So there's really only, it doesn't matter, it can only go on one way. So we put the screw onto the, put the ball nut onto the worm shaft. Try and get it towards the middle. And now what you want to do is you want to put on the ball guides. So the ball guides are, they come in halves, and if you look at them, let me lay them all out, they're identical. So what that means is there's no left and right or front and back piece. So we just take any 2 halves. I didn't try and keep them together, which 2 were together and which 2 weren't together. And obviously there's only one way you can put them together. Side by side like that, making a U-shaped kind of shaft thing. And then they go into the big screws, obviously, into the screw left, diagonally. And then we'll put these 2 together. Alright, and then I'm just going to lightly tap them down with the wooden handle of my mallet to make sure that they're seated. Maybe pick this up and wiggle it around a little bit back and forth. Okay, so now I have the balls separated into 2 containers, each containing 31 balls. So that cup has 31 balls, and then this bag, I'm going to pour them on the lid of the cup. This lid has 31 balls. And obviously each half of the ball guide is going to get 31 balls. And I'm just going to, do them with this. So I'm just going to pick them up with these tweezers and just start dropping them in. So we'll come back when I have all of the balls put into the ball screw. Alright, so a couple of things I've noticed while I was doing this. You really do need to turn the worm gear on the ball screw just by picking up off the table and just turning it back and forth, run it one end to the other. That helps distribute all the balls. You can also, if you have a pair of tweezers like this, I can put them in here, and then I can kind of pinch it and push the ball in, because the grease is thick, and these little balls are not going to just displace that grease by their own weight. Whoops. And every once in a while one will jump out and go into the the grease. Like now they're like kind of stuck again. I can't get them in, so now I got to push them down. Just be gentle when you're pushing on them. Keep an eye on them. And this is another reason, you know, why I asked myself, well, why do I need to separate them into two piles? Why don't I just put, you know, an equal number of balls in each one? And it's because you can't keep track. You know, you do some on one side, you know, and then you do some on the other one. And if you're pulling them out of the same container, you're going to lose track of how many you put on each side. Alright, now that all the balls are in on each side, we're going to install this ball guide cover plate, which is just this little cap piece that drops on top. And then it gets held in with these two screws, slotted screws. I hate slotted screws, but that's what they are. And now we'll just give it a test, make sure it turns freely, which it does. That's very nice. Try and distribute this grease around on here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe off all this grease that's at the end. Ooh, fell off my table. This shaft is like, you know, 3.5 feet long. Try and smear this on here. I think the deal is that there's enough grease in here. I think this grease won't fit. And the balls and everything feels nice and tight. There's like zero end play on this right now. If I push back and forth on this ball nut, there's no end play at all. So that's a good thing. Next step, put everything back inside of the steering box. Alright, let's put the little end cap back on the housing. First I'm just going to take a little RTV sealant and put a little squirt of sealant around the edge of this just to help it stay sealed up. I don't want to get any in there, you know, on the bearing or anything. This is just silicone. I put the plug in, you get a socket, and just tap it on. Trying to hold this on the camera. I think that's it. Alright, so the next step is to put the ball nut and the worm shaft, the input, this is called the input shaft, this thing that comes off of the steering wheel, into the steering box. But in order to do that, you want to have your bearings, you want to put the bearings on the end of the shaft first, and they just slip on. And then remember, the bearings are in a set of cups inside here. So I want to pre-lube these bearings before I put them in there. I don't just want to put them in dry. So I'm going to pack the bearings. And this is just, you know, it's like pretty much like any other kind of bearing, the way you pack them. So I'm going to take a little bit of grease, put it in the palm of my hand like this. I'm going to take the bearing and I'm just going to work it around, work all the grease into all the little holes all the way around on the bearing. I'm satisfied with that for now. It's sufficiently greased. I don't hear any balls rattling around now. And just remember which way these go onto the shaft. The race inside is a cup, so you want to put it this way so that like the balls are facing out on the shaft. If you put it the other way, then what is the bearing going to hit when it goes inside the housing? It's just going to I'm going to hit the back side of the little cage that holds the bearing. If I put it this way, with the ball, you know, with the taper towards the bottom of the shaft, then when they go in, the bearings are going to go into that cup because it's narrower on the bottom and wider on the top. So There's another set of bearings here that goes on the other end of the shaft, so I'm going to grease that one up too. So when I get done with that, we'll put the input shaft into the housing.